One of the movies I grew up watching on repeat was The Sandlot. I assume I'm not alone. I mean, what's not to love about it? And like a lot of movies of that era, there was always a line that was meant to stick with you after your first viewing, after your 100th viewing. And no, I'm not talking about, "You're killing me, Smalls," or any of the other ones that make us laugh. I'm talking about heroes get remembered, but legends never die. And I think that has really affected me when it has come to how I think of history. Like, sure, we all remember some of the names we hear in our history classes, but we love a great story. Think about how much we love telling the story of Rosa Parks or the March on Washington when we talk about the Civil Rights Movement. The best of these stories distill what a whole movement was about. They sometimes present people as mythical figures or give a specific lens to a larger narrative. They live on so that when we're bogged down in the details, we have something to remember later. This episode will expand on the story of the Federal Theater Project as told in the last episode. Oh yeah, I'm not ready to say goodbye to the FTP yet. We're going to delve into the story of one of the FTP's most famous productions, which, unlike so many legends in history, actually did happen. This is the story of a labor opera written and staged by a bunch of young artists who all had strong and powerful voices, who saw their art as the key to understanding the turbulent world around them. This is the story of how this show came to be one of the defining moments of the theater, a testament to what happens when a show really taps perhaps a little bit too close to the pulse of the nation. It's a story of a group of artists who knew the value of their art and the power their stories had to inspire and wouldn't allow that art to be crushed. This is the story of a ragtag group of friends who, through their shared love of theater, learn to rely on each other when they have to get out of the biggest pickle any of them had ever been in. Right in the middle of the Federal Theater Project's life was the Cradle Will Rock. I'm Ricky, and this is Pocket Dramaturg Episode 5, Legends Never Die, the tale of the Cradle Will Rock. So this episode is acting as sort of, I guess not a sequel, more of a midquel, like The Lion King 1.5. And just like that movie, you can enjoy this one on its own, but it's better if you have the original one for reference. I'll be referencing some of the names and topics mentioned in that previous episode on the Federal Theater Project and Hallie Flanagan. But if you want to know more about the story of the Federal Theater Project, I recommend you hit pause, go listen to that one, and come right back. This story is just a snapshot in the larger picture that is the Federal Theater Project. What you need to know is that the Federal Theater Project was part of the Works Progress Administration, whose goal was to get theater artists of all backgrounds back to work. Its director, Hallie Flanagan, was a professor who had a background in teaching her students about how to be experimental and adaptable. She had a proponent for new works that asked questions of the world. She was committed to getting people back to work as well as putting on high-quality shows. Last, I'll remind you that when Hallie Flanagan was first formulating the structure of the FTP, she had ambitions of finding success through community. Essentially, she hoped that by casting a large enough net across the country, it would plant the seed of theater and make it a vital part of communities that had no tradition of it previously, and have the Federal Theater Project as its national connector. So before I get solely into the Cradle Will Rock, let me tell you a little bit about what activity the FTP was up to. I mentioned in my previous episode that when the FTP was created, it was like kind of when your boss tells you that they want to see growth in some area, but then they leave it up to you to figure out what that means. But Hallie Flanagan had conviction in what she wanted to accomplish, so that at least gave them some direction to start with. In 1935, the Federal Theater Project began renting the Lafayette Theater in Harlem. The FTP knew that without a concerted effort, the limited resources could very easily and quickly get used to help predominantly white institutions and reinforce the color barrier that had existed in theater throughout the country. That's why in 1935, the FTP established a company dedicated to creating work for black artists. The whole process of establishing this unit is so fascinating, especially when you put it in its own proper historical context within Harlem. I couldn't put James Shapiro's book, The Playbook, down during this section. Long story short, in an effort to avoid the politics of Harlem at the time, specifically where most of it was owned by white landowners and had resulted in an air of tension throughout Harlem, Hallie was looking for a black theater artist to take charge of the unit that they were creating. Naturally, this was an uphill battle. First, trying to convince the white administrators of the WPA and the community to settle on a single person. One side wanted leadership that reflected themselves and the art that they wanted to do, and the other used commonly used tactics of looking for the quote-unquote most qualified candidate to get someone that they wanted. Eventually, they found someone to agree on, an actor, director, writer named Rose McClendon, who was one of the most respected black performers on Broadway at the time. Rose took the job, but she was an actor first and felt that her knowledge was limited, and she knew what the higher-ups wanted, and so she decided to bring on someone who could help her bridge the business side of the job as the executive director, also who would just happen to be white as well. His name was John Houseman, a relatively new director himself who Rose had met during a show called Panic. One condition he had before joining was that he would be able to bring along a 20-year-old up-and-coming director who he had recently seen play Tybalt in Romeo and Juliet. More on him later. What some have come to suspect is the reason that Rose wanted a partner in the work was really that there would always be a steady hand alongside of her as she became more aware that her health was in decline. By summer 1936, Rose McClendon would pass away from cancer at age 51. When Rose got ill, the responsibilities of the unit were left in the hands of Houseman. As a white man suddenly in charge of the operation of a black theater company, Houseman didn't want to rock the boat too hard. He doubled down on the mission Rose had strived for while still being able to stay in his wheelhouse. He split the company into two wings, one of which was based on Rose's vision and looked for works to produce by black playwrights and performers. The other was better suited to his skills, which would be used to stage classics, first of which would be Macbeth. If Rose McClendon had been fully in charge, there is almost no doubt that she would have found a black director for this production. This wasn't even the first all-black production of the play in recent years, but she wasn't. Houseman was in charge, and he gave the job to that 20-year-old actor he brought along with him to the FTP. His name was Orson Welles, like Citizen Kane Orson Welles. In the name of moving on, I'm going to quickly run over what Orson Welles' Macbeth was like because it's not really as important to the rest of our story. Essentially, by the 1930s, there started to be a return to the tradition of staging Shakespeare in the vernacular of the time. For the first 100 years of Shakespeare's plays, you were essentially supposed to give the audience a setting, a costume design that would be familiar to them. It was supposed to reflect the world around them. Somewhere in the 1700s, this stopped, and that's how we get that antiquated image of Shakespeare's work that can still maintain to today. So by the 1930s, people had been having this, regal, reverential type of Shakespeare for almost 200 years, and it was really starting to bore people, especially critics. So people like Orson Welles tried to reinvigorate the work by changing things up. Welles set his version in Haiti and placed the castle in a jungle and the witches practiced voodoo. It was noted that Welles was a lot more into spectacle than the sacredness of conventional Shakespeare production, and that's why he was trying to take such big swings. Welles was a hard director to work for. He wasn't the kind of person to just let the actor explore. He knew what he wanted, and he was going to tell you what he wanted until you gave it to him, no matter how many times you had to keep running the scene. At one point, he rehearsed for 3 days straight with breaks only for people to nap. He was notoriously working 20 hours a day, sleeping in the theater. This was his first professional directing gig. He wanted the actors, the audience, the critics, everyone to know that this was Orson Welles' Macbeth. Opening night came and started over an hour late. One critic, needing to meet his deadline, had to leave before the end. And that wasn't because of any issues backstage. It was just because the show was a community event. There was a large audience coming from Harlem, and the audience was having such a fun time at the pre-show, there was no rush to get started. I want shows to be more like that. But once it did get started, there was this really fascinating dichotomy. On the one hand, many in the audience believed this show to be one of the best experiences that they've ever had in the theater. On the other, no one was really sure that it was good Shakespeare. The audience wasn't segregated as was customary in a lot of theaters, yet black audience members didn't appreciate feeling that the white audience members were there only because it was fashionable and not out of genuine appreciation for the art they were doing. Goodness, if you could read some of the out-of-pocket stuff the white people had to say, from belittling the black artist's capability to handle Shakespeare to downright fetishizing fellow audience members, it was crazy. But even among that, the show was a hit and even went on tour. It was exactly what the Federal Theater Project needed early in its run. I go into this much detail with this one just because Houseman and Wells, with all of their conviction and wanting to make a splash, were about to become two of the driving forces behind the Cradle Will Rock. One of the phrases that I have to always take with a grain of salt is anytime I hear someone talk about how this show is so relevant to our time. What I want you to do from now on, every time you hear someone talk about how timely their show is, or how much a show speaks to the world that they live in, realize the Cradle Will Rock was that times a million. This part of the story begins when Orson Welles met composer Mark Blitzstein after a performance of another FTP show called Horse Eats Hat. These guys were really great at picking names. Mark Blitzstein was the kind of composer that audiences of the day knew of, but didn't know of in the same vein of a Gershwin. He was someone that everyone respected, though. Like, I'm a fan of the NBA, and I think of it like when players such as Michael Jordan are always going to be remembered, but because of his greatness, there are only players who real fans of the NBA know about. All that's to say, I see you, Dan Marley. Mark was a prodigy as a child. He came from a socialist family who took note of his love of composers such as Stravinsky. They turned his attention to composition as he got older, and by the 1930s he was living in New York and absorbing the work of composers like Kurt Weill and learned from watching the work of Brecht. Mark would actually go on to help translate the Threepenny Opera for Off-Broadway in 1954. He studied how these creators composed their shows and applied it to his songwriting and into his first reviews. Mark was one of those special talents who was able to act as a composer and a lyricist at the time. He could write beautiful melodies, stunning harmonies, and natural, pointed lyrics packaged in music you couldn't forget. In 1935, he was playing a scene that he had written for his friend Brecht. It was about the concept of prostitution. After listening, Brecht encouraged Mark to expand the project and to think bigger than what our typical definition of prostitution is and how it takes place in modern society. Essentially, he wanted Mark to explore the question if every person has a price to get ahead, and what does that do to the people around them. This is what became the foundation of the Cradle Will Rock. Mark set the show in Steeltown, USA, a place under the thumb of Mr. Mister, an anti-union boss who has his fingers all over the community. As each character waits for Mr. Mister to bail them out of jail, the characters each show the audience their story, and through it, show the different aspects of corruption. The Reverend begins to tail his sermons to the interest of Mr. Mister's family. The journalists give Mr. Mister's son a job to keep him happy. Those in authority look the other way when he makes pro-union figures in the community the targets of violence. Only Larry Foreman, the union organizer, is able to resist taking anything from Mr. Mister and continues to beg the others in the jail to join him. While everyone else is too far in deep to get away, Larry ultimately wins the union vote. Cradle lives in a tradition of theater that strips away non-all essential elements of a play to help focus on the message. Think of the medieval morality play, Everyman, where every character represents themes that characterize the lives of all people. Or a more modern example, like Christopher Chen's Passage, where character names are broken down to letters and the script is intentionally vague in order to make the audience engage with the material and identify their own internal biases. The vagueness of Steeltown, USA, and the characters by names of Mr. Mister and Larry Foreman are there to act as avatars for the countless workers and the bosses. Surely this won't make anyone mad. Surely no one will think this is trying to incite violence or worse. Communism. After hearing the score for Cradle, Orson Welles was obsessed. He made Mark promise that regardless of who produced the show, he needed to direct it. Orson and John Houseman had recently left the Negro unit of the FTP and were now in charge of Project 891, which would allow them to produce the show with Hallie Flanagan's approval. Of course, knowing where she was at the head of the FTP, she knew this would be a hard sell, but after a lot of negotiating with Houseman and Welles, the pair finally won. I wasn't able to find a whole lot about the rehearsal process of The Cradle Will Rock. The process started very early in March ahead of its opening in June, so everyone had a very long time to work on the show. Unfortunately, all the prep time in the world couldn't get everyone ready for what was coming when they got close to opening. Even by the time the FTP agreed to produce The Cradle Will Rock, it had already been a project that had some trouble getting produced. A show with this much to say was scaring people left and right, and why wouldn't it? The country wasn't in the best shape regarding labor relations. In 1936, auto workers from GM began a strike that resulted in Henry Ford calling on 600 armed guards to keep a union from forming. By the beginning of summer, the larger steel companies began to recognize unions, but smaller firms were not ready to adopt. On May 30th, 1937, 2 weeks before Cradle's June 16th opening, Republic Steel, one of these smaller companies, ordered the Chicago police to attack picketers, their wives, and children. They wound up killing 3 people and injuring 84. This is not a good look, especially when the government is about to open a show talking about labor relations. June 10th, 6 days before The Cradle Will Rock is set to open, the dominoes began to start falling. Hallie Flanagan got the notification that the FTP's budget had been cut 30%, and that led to 1,700 jobs lost, which started the picketing. On June 12th, an even bigger issue rose. Hallie was given the order that no shows were to open until July 1st. This included The Cradle Will Rock. Funnily enough, only 3 shows were actually supposed to open before July 1st, The Cradle Will Rock and 2 others. Those 2 others were still permitted to open. But Houseman and Welles weren't going to be stopped so easily. They continued to rehearse and even got a dress rehearsal in on June 15th, which could have gone better. But that's not unheard of. Maybe it would be one of those classic cases where a rough dress rehearsal leads to a great opening night, right? So now we've reached the morning of the show. Morning came, everyone arrived, and they found a big problem. The Maxine Elliott Theater was padlocked shut, with armed guards out front. What? Houseman and Welles were allowed into the makeshift office that they had made, but nothing was supposed to be going down. Okay, time to weigh the options. Is there any hope for opening the Maxine Elliott tonight? No? Okay, the entire thing was on lockdown. The sets, the costumes, the instruments, even the leading man's wig were all classified as property of the WPA. Nothing was leaving. Okay, maybe this can work. Maybe this can still work. Orson Welles, he wasn't totally sold on the giant glass-looking set in the first place. Maybe this can be okay. So they can't do the show at the Maxine Elliott, and they can't have any of the design elements. Maybe they can go to another theater and have everyone do the show there. It's a bit of a stretch to find a theater in time, but maybe... The unions heard. We've got another problem. As I'm sure you're well aware, the unions are very specific about what they do and don't allow their members to participate in. It's all in the name of making sure that there's fair treatment. In this case, when the WPA was started, the leaders, especially those of the music and theater projects, knew that they would need some kind of help from the unions. As I mentioned before, the budgets for all of these programs were tiny, so they could never hope to get any of the talent present in the unions, the actors, the musicians, the stagehands, any of them at the rate that was required by the union. The musicians union gave a hard no to any plan of moving to another theater. To them, moving somewhere else meant that the agreement with the WPA didn't need to be followed. So if the musicians went, they needed rehearsal time and their full union rate, which of course, the Cradle Will Rock could not afford. Then Actors Equity backed the musicians union. The actors in the Cradle Will Rock wouldn't be allowed on stage to perform their show either. Okay. So Houseman and Welles have no theater, no sets, no costume, no musicians. And you want to hear the crazy thing? they're still gonna have a show tonight. So with no idea, they figured, go for broke. Can't get worse than this. Houseman and Wells got a hold of the press to make sure everyone knew the show was still happening. But come back later to know the rest of the details. They didn't have it all together, but they had the concepts of a plan. In the chaos, they did learn that they did have one saving grace, one Hail Mary. The only person in the whole production who was not part of the union, the only one who could get up on stage with zero hassle, just so happened to be the man who wrote the show, Mark Blitzstein. Houseman and Wells had a sliver of hope, even if it meant Mark had to sing every part. But that's all these guys needed. Next up, they had to find something for Mark to play on, and somewhere for him to do it. They called up their young assistant, Jean Rosenthal. They gave her $5 and told her to go find a piano. While Jean searched, everyone else brainstormed what they could do about the actors. Maybe Mark could do the whole thing, but that should really only be the last resort. Then Wells concocted a plan. An awful plan. Orson Welles concocted a wonderful, awful plan. Why, if the actors can't go on stage, Orson said with a glare, then they shall sit in the audience and perform Cradle from there. Wait, no, now is not the time to do the Grinch. We have no time. Orson decided to be tricky. The unions made it clear that the performers were forbidden from getting on stage to perform the show, so they would just not go on stage at all and perform their show as audience members, exercising their freedom of speech. This had to be a volunteer basis. They couldn't demand anyone participate, especially because there was the real possibility of ruining their careers by doing this and being sent back out amongst all of the other unemployed people. They would come, but if they felt the need to back out, then they would, and Mark would cover anybody who wasn't there. By the afternoon, they still had no theater, and the audience was starting to gather outside the Maxine Elliott because they were starting to realize something was going on here. But Jean Rosenthal had a piano and bribed someone to get it on a truck. Houseman and Wells told Jean to just keep driving around and check back in every 10 minutes until they had a plan. The time for a curtain was quickly approaching. The actors had been keeping the audience entertained outside for hours, and just before 8, the call came in. They had a theater. They had done it. With no time to lose, a caravan of audience members and actors began to walk from the 935-seat Maxine Elliott Theater on 39th Street, 20 blocks north, to the 1,700-seat Venice Theater on 7th and 58th Street. They told people to invite friends and family to help fill the seats. And by 8:50, the audience and the cast had poured into the seats of the Venice Theater. It was go time. Mark Blitzstein entered the stage to the beat-up piano that Jean Rosenthal had found, with one spotlight on him. Mark began to play, and as he started to sing, everyone quickly became aware that he wasn't singing alone. The spotlight operator looked around to find the other voice and finally found her in one of the boxes. It was Olive Stanton, the actress playing Moll. Looking back, her castmates made it clear that if Olive hadn't been so brave, none of them would have had the courage to do it either. What happened next is what solidified the legend of the Cradle Will Rock. For the next 2 hours, cast members rose from their places in the audience, spoke their lines, and sang their songs. They doubled up on parts, ran back and forth through the aisles and seats all over. They improvised their blocking, which I'm sure would have made control freak Orson Welles furious under different circumstances, all while Mark Blitzstein accompanied them on the piano. It's like that saying about luck. It's when preparation meets opportunity. Every person believed so much in their material and what it had to say that in spite of missing materials, a padlocked theater, armed guards, they were going to make it happen. And when the show finished, the audience erupted in cheers and let them know how successful they had been. In the days following the performance, Houseman and Wells had, as my man Ricky Ricardo would have to say, some splaining to do. Hallie Flanagan wasn't happy because she knew that this would not help the growing suspicion of radical behavior in the Federal Theater Project. The entire cast was sent on a 2-week leave while they figured out what to do. Houseman and Wells wanted to continue the show or even have permission to move it to a commercial venue. Not wanting to wait, they figured it's better to ask for forgiveness than permission. Houseman and Wells rented out the Venice Theater full time and let the cast continue to perform for that 2 weeks, the same way they had their opening night with Mark alone at the piano. And of course, this sealed that Halley and the Federal Theater Project had decided that they were done with the Cradle Will Rock. Orson Welles left the FTP after this whole ordeal, and John Houseman would be fired when a new rule was instituted that non-Americans, Houseman was not a citizen yet, couldn't be employed by the WPA. The two, now both looking for work, took the opportunity to finally join forces in a commercial theater, and they created the Mercury Theater. And one of the first productions of the Mercury was, you guessed it, The Cradle Will Rock. John Houseman would work with Orson Welles for many years and be present as a jack of all trades in Hollywood. In 1968, he would become the founding member of the drama department at Juilliard. Students that he had worked with in his time there included Kevin Kline, Patti LuPone, Christopher Reeve, Mandy Patinkin, Kevin Conroy, and Robin Williams. Orson Welles never had a problem staying busy after that. He continued to stage shows for the Mercury. He even found time to scare the living daylights out of the public when he did his reading of War of the Worlds in 1938, and acted his reading of the book so well that some people thought the Martians were actually invading. He signed a film contract in 1939 that would move the Mercury to Hollywood in 1941. The same year, he would appear in his career-defining film, Citizen Kane. As the House Un-American Activities Committee began to turn their witch hunt towards Hollywood in the 1940s, Orson became a target. Fed up with being perceived as a target, he packed up and moved to Europe. From there, his career largely pivoted to films, with roles in The Magnificent Ambersons, The Third Man, Othello, and his greatest roles in The Muppet Movie and his final role as Unicron in the Transformers movie, before he passed away in 1985. The events of Cradle's opening turned the show and everyone in it into the stuff of legend. Some of the cast members went on to have success throughout the rest of the 20th century. Jean Rosenthal, who saved the day with the piano, went on to become one of the greatest lighting designers in theater history. She worked on shows like West Side Story, The Sound of Music, Fiddler on the Roof, and Cabaret. Will Geer, the original Mr. Mister, went on to portray Grandpa Walton in the TV show The Waltons. Howard Da Silva had an incredible career on stage. He originated the role of Judd Fry in the original production of Oklahoma in 1943. He appeared in Fiorello and played Ben Franklin in the original production of 1776. He would also be one of the hundreds of actors blacklisted as a result of the House Un-American Activities Committee. Mark Blitzstein remained active, especially when it came to productions of Cradle. He even sparked up a friendship with the young Leonard Bernstein when he was a student looking to stage the show. Not that it's important to the story, but they would remain friends for many, many years, often asking for each other's input on projects. Mark even wrote some of the initial lyrics for Somewhere from West Side Story. Side note, when I was describing this whole interaction between these two to my wife, I did my Leonard Bernstein impression, and I promise I tried so hard. I tried so hard to recreate that for this episode, but I couldn't do it. I could not figure it out. I'm so sorry. He composed for plays, opera, and the radio. In 1958, he was subpoenaed to appear before HUAC for his association with the Communist Party. In a baller move, he said, "Yeah, I was a member, but who are you to ask me about that?" In 1964, Mark's life would be cut short while in Martinique. In January, he was rushed to a hospital after being found injured and calling for help. He had told everyone so far that he had been in a car accident. After a change of heart and asking for a full medical examination, Mark told the truth. He had been attacked. Those who knew him well knew that Mark was openly gay. Wanting to protect his family from the scrutiny of the day, he kept that part of his life from them. That's why he initially insisted on the car accident story. What really happened was that Mark had been at a bar and approached 3 sailors and made a move on one of them. The 3 proceeded to attack him in a manner that ultimately ended Mark's life. Remembering Mark Blitzstein in 1984, Orson Welles had this to say: "Mark Blitzstein was almost a saint. He was so totally and serenely convinced of the Eden which was waiting for us all on the other side of the revolution that there was no way of talking politics to him. He didn't care who was in the Senate or what Mr. Roosevelt said. He was just a spokesman of the bourgeoisie. When he came into the room, the lights got brighter. He was an engine, a rocket directed in one direction, which was his opera, which he almost believed had only to be performed to start the revolution." This story, while a part of the overarching narrative of the Federal Theater Project, needs to be told on its own. Initially, a little bit of insight on the creative process. Initially, this episode and my previous one on Hallie Flanagan and the FTP were meant to be one long episode. But as I wrote, I began to notice a need to separate them. Because I think that there's something really important here to count. The story of the Cradle Will Rock has more or less a positive ending compared to the Federal Theater Project as a whole. We have the inclination, especially in history, to essentially do the reverse of losing the forest for the trees. What I mean is that sometimes we become so focused on the big, sweeping story that we fail to give proper due to the little story. It can be easy to write off the FTP because you know it lost its particular war. But if you reduce everything the FTP was to that story, then you lose the fact that there were definitive wins that people were able to learn from and use for inspiration later in life. This is a call to action. As our world slips farther and farther into a realm of overwhelming chaos, it can become very easy to slide into apathy, to lay back into negativity. Those who create that chaos only have fear as their ally. And there is nothing more terrifying to people like that than when you see a group of people shout that the Cradle will rock, and have several hundred more stand and cheer in solidarity. Let this be a reminder to count the wins, no matter how small they are. And if they present you with the biggest pickle you have ever seen, a problem that seems so insurmountable on your own, I hope that you find the strength in your community, like that ragtag group of theater lovers did during the Cradle Will Rock, to do what must be done. It's in these times where we are most able to stand firm and say, this matters. And when you do that, the world doesn't forget. And that's the end of the episode. For more information on this episode's topic, I have once again to shout out James Shapiro's book, The Playbook. It was the backbone for both of these last two episodes. I also want to acknowledge these additional sources: Scott Miller's Rebels with Applause, Howard Pollack's biography on Mark Blitzstein, Tim Robbins' 1999 film Cradle Will Rock, the film 1980s production of The Cradle Will Rock, and its cast recording. Thanks for listening to this episode of Pocket Dramaturg. This episode was hosted, written, edited, and produced by Ricky Ortega. Associate producer is Bridget Martinez. You can follow the show on Instagram at pocket_dramaturg, TikTok and Blue Sky at Pocket Dramaturg, and you can subscribe to the show on YouTube as well. Last, if you enjoyed the show, leave a comment and share it with someone you know. See y'all next time.